Okay, welcome. So for this tutorial, we're going to be looking at the Puppet Pin tool, or the Puppet Pin system in After Effects. Now you may notice that we're not actually in After Effects right now. We are in Photoshop. And previously, I've done all the Photoshop work ahead of time in terms of eliminating a background from a particular image. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and do that as part of the tutorial for those of you who may not have ever used Photoshop to do something like this. So hopefully most of you have, but if not, here it is. So I'm in Photoshop and I've opened this image that I found of Vladimir Putin in T-pose. You know, there's some weird things on the internet. I'm a little uncomfortable by this, but the reason I chose a T-pose is right, what we're going to do is we're going to be, essentially bending his arms around and bending his legs around, which should look really funny. But having him in a T-pose makes at least the arm motion a little bit easier. And so the next thing we need to do is we need to eliminate this gray background from behind the image. And you can see this was just a screenshot I took. There's some other icons down there that need to go as well. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the quick selection tool, or in this new version of Photoshop, there's also the object selection tool. So I'm going to go ahead and use the object selection tool and see how well that works for me in this case. I think it's going to work really well just because the background is so uniform in color. So I'm going to go to the object selection tool, which is over here. And then all you do is you click and drag to draw an outline around it, and you don't need to be super close. You just need to be enough so that it has some sense of what you're grabbing. If the background's busier, you're going to need to get a little bit closer to the object, and you might need to do some cleanup afterwards. So I'm just going to go ahead and click and drag, all the way around, and hopefully it'll go up between his legs as well without me needing to do that. I'm just going to click and drag, and it'll think about it, and it did a really great job, right? There's a little bit of space here where it didn't quite grab every pixel, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit, which I can hold down Option and use the scroll wheel, or I can use 2 fingers on my trackpad to zoom in and out. And so there's this little bit of space here, and I know from previous experience that quick selection might work, and if not, then I might need to use one of the other more manual versions. And so what I want to do is by default, it's going to add to the selection, and the selection we have is his body. And what we want to do is we want to remove this little bit here. So I'm just going to hold down Option. I'm going to click and drag a little bit, and it's going to remove a bit more. Now, at this point, the brush is too big, and it's going to grab parts of his thighs. And so if I use the opening or closing bracket key on the keyboard, I can either enlarge or shrink the size of my brush. So I'm going to shrink that down a little bit. I'm going to hold down Option or Alt again to subtract. I'm going to click and drag a little bit further. And you'll see I got a little bit of his thigh outside of the selection area. And you really have to say, does it matter that, a little bit of Putin's thigh is there or not there? And I could either continue up or I could leave this here. If I choose to continue up, the tool to use is going to just be the lasso tool, and then I can just hand draw this. And again, I need to hold down Option to subtract, or Alt if you're on Windows, and I can just click up here and manually do this selection. And then using the plus, there's these couple areas where his thigh is not selected, so if I was really being anal, I can just click and drag in the default settings to select that, right? And that's probably close enough. Okay, so I've got him selected, and so then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit Command or Control C and Command or Control V to copy and paste him to a new layer. And once I've done that, if I turn the visibility of layer 1 off, or it may say background here, then I should get this grid in the back, which signifies transparency, and then just this creepy image of Vladimir Putin. So now that I've done all of that, I'm going to go ahead and save this. So I'm going to save my file, right? You can go up to File or hit Command or Control S to save. And I don't want to save it to the desktop. I want to put it in my project folder. So in this case, this is actually, it doesn't matter. This is a different one. But I'm just going to just call it Putin and hit OK. And then we'll go ahead and let's go over to After Effects. Okay, in After Effects, I'm going to want to create a new project. And I'm going to want to double click to bring this character in here. I want to make sure I go to the right folder that I put it in. Here's Putin. I'm going to import it as, I could import it as footage, or I could do a composition and retain layer sizes. I'm going to choose composition, retain layer sizes. I'm going to hit open, hit OK. And then now I've got this composition. So I'm going to drag, oops, actually I'm just going to double click on this Putin composition. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can see him, right? So the full frame is 1920 by 1080. And here is our puppet. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the Puppet Pin tool to start to animate this static image. And the Puppet Pin tool is great for certain types of animation. And then it also can do really comical and ridiculous things to certain objects. And so we're going to look at animating him. We're also going to look at animating the woman with the flag. And really we're specifically going to animate the flag. So, but we're going to use him as a base. And one of the things we need to do is we need to change the background color of the composition so that the grid, if any of it hangs off of his body, is more apparent. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Composition, Composition Settings, and I just want to change this color to the background to something that he stands off of, and it's nice and bright, and that grid will also stand off of. So if it overhangs him, I'm going to hit OK. And now I'm going to go ahead and create some of these puppet pins. And so the Puppet Pin Position tool, you can hit Command or Control P to access that. It's this push pin looking icon here. And there's actually several tools down here, right? We're going to primarily look at the Puppet Pin Position tool, but there's other types of tools that we're going to look at here in a little bit. So the Puppet Pin, I've got this set, and then there's this option to show the mesh or not show the mesh. Right now we want to show the mesh because we're starting to work with this, and I want to show you what's happening as we go through it. So to start with, the pins indicate where the figure will essentially rotate around, and also what is stuck. So you can imagine that we're taking this image and we're turning it into a piece of like latex or rubber that we can stretch and tweak in all sorts of different directions, but it's going to be stuck wherever we have pins placed. And so oftentimes it's good to do like pins essentially through the spine if you're doing a figure, at the hips, at the knees, at the ankles, at the shoulders, you know, maybe a couple others in here, at the elbows and wrists, right, are good places to do that. So we're going to try and keep this pretty simple to start with. So we're not going to do a whole bunch of pins. But first, let's go ahead and we'll just put a pin right in his belly button. Right. As soon as we do that, we get this mesh that gets overlaid on top of this figure. And if I have this one pin here and I click and drag, I'm going to be moving the whole figure, right? Because I only have one pin set. And I'm going to undo that, but you'll notice that moves his whole figure. If I set a second pin, and I'm going to do one just right about where his heart is, right? First, you'll notice that between these two pins, I get a much denser mesh because that means that there's more motion here. And now if I click and drag, what it does is, one, I can rotate around the other pin, and two, right, I can start to stretch or shrink his body, right, based on these two pins. Okay, I'm going to undo that. because I want to keep him, you know, pretty set. So let's go ahead and put one in his neck and put one in his forehead as well, right? And so now you'll see that, right, I can bend his body, and you'll also notice that, right, the pin puppet tool, obviously I can go really far and stretch things out, but it's not static, right? It depends on where else I have pins in terms of what moves. And so there's a little bit of, everything is connected with this, right? So let's go ahead and pin his shoulders. And then why don't we just go ahead and pin his fingers too? Right, and so I'm going to go over to this arm, right? And so now, right, I can bend this arm down, and you'll see that that the whole arm bends, and you know, it doesn't bend where it should. You'll also notice that his armpit moves in some when I'm working on that. And so, right, so you can see that, you know, for human figures, this might be a little bit funny to use this tool very frequently. But for other things, like say you want to animate you have static images of blades of grass, right? This could be a really nice way to get an animation of blades of grass, you know, where you didn't have one before. If I go ahead and put another pin in his elbow, right, I'm going to have, you know, a better representation of what's going on here. If I drop a pin in his wrist as well, right? But you'll also notice that, right, it is really bending. It's not so much rotating as it is bending these different pins. If I want to select multiple points so that I can, say, rotate or move a whole set of things at once, I can go ahead and I can either shift and click, or I can hold down, shift, and click and drag to select those points all at once. And then, right, I can move those together in one unit. So those are the basics of placing the pins, right, and controlling those pin placements. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to be able to control some of this. So, right, like if I use the pin position tool and I select one of these pins, like say the elbow, you can also delete pins by just selecting them and hitting delete on the keyboard. And so right now I'm going to go ahead and actually delete all the ones on this arm except his shoulder, and I'm going to put one back on the fingers. So if I was to go and pull this down, you'll note that, right, his whole body, granted his legs are moving a little bit too, I'm not too worried about that, but you'll notice that when I make this motion, right, his chest changes shape pretty dramatically in here. And that's not something that we want. So I'm going to go ahead and hit undo. And so what we want is we want this area to deform less, right? So it bends more naturally like a joint would. And to do that, we go up here to the Puppet Pin Position tool icon, and we click and hold the mouse button down, and then we can get the Puppet Starch Pin tool. And what the Puppet Starched Pin tool does is it basically creates an area where less deformation happens. So if I put this right in his armpit, and then I go and I rotate this arm, right, you'll see that it still deforms a little bit, but it's significantly less intense deformation than it was before. This is also a good way to isolate bending in joints and make things that should be hard, that should be stable, stay stable. So I'm going to go ahead and do a puppet pin position, right in the middle of his elbow. And then I'm going to do a starch pin on either side of his elbow. So just one there and one there. And so now when I rotate this part of his arm, right, it's still a wet noodle below the elbow, but it looks much more natural when it blends. Not that much more natural, but it looks more natural when it bends at the elbow, right? There's a lot less deformation happening. And I could potentially even put another starch pin here so that that bend looks more natural. So if I scroll in a little bit and hit the letter H to reframe this, and then go back to my pin tool, I should be able to drop another one here. And now if I try and rotate this, right, I get a much better elbow, right? You know, these aren't quite exactly right, and maybe I actually need to move them around a little bit. But right, where you can drag a position pin around, you cannot move a starch pin, right? You just have to, if it's not right where you want it, you'd have to click on it, delete it, and bring it back, right? But that's so that's a way that you can create better motion around joints so things don't get too out of control for you. So how do we animate these different points, right? And that is one of the questions that we need to cover. So I'm going to hit Command 0 on the, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I am going to use the letter H. I'm going to reframe this, and I'm going to go ahead and actually make this window a little bit bigger. So how do we go ahead and keyframe the positions on these pins? And so the way we do that is pretty simple. So first I'm going to go back to my puppet pin position tool, and I'm going to go ahead and pull his arm straight back out again. And then once I've got this set, and you could set more pins in his body if you want. I'm just going to work with one arm or maybe both of his arms here a little bit and maybe make his body do something ridiculous in the middle. So I've got my first frame here. I'm going to go ahead and move forward just a little bit. I'm going to have this elbow bend down, and you'll see that by default these things are already starting to be keyframed. And so then I can have this arm go, up and fold back onto his head, and you can see how bizarrely deformed these things get very quickly. And you'll also note down below there are all of these dots here, and each one of those dots represents a keyframe. If I was to flip out, right, so if I go back to here and play this through, right, it's not playing in real time, but now all those preview frames are done, right? And so you can see the difference with the shoulder here and the shoulder and the armpit here based on how this motion works, right? His body gets more distorted over here, where it's less distorted on the other side. So if I go back to frame 0 and I was to add another starch pin here, right, and maybe another starch pin up here on the top of his shoulder and maybe on the top of this shoulder, then when I go ahead and play this forward, right, his chest moves a little bit, but it stays pretty much the same. Now, right, this arm is clearly like totally out of whack. This one's a little out of whack because I haven't done all the work there, but I've done some. So the next thing that I want to show you is just ways you can make, this silly. So we're going to use the puppet position tool again. We're going to go back to frame 0 so we can be at the beginning of our animation. And I'm going to go ahead and create 2 more position pins here and maybe 2 more here and here. And what we're going to do is we're going to go forward past where his arms stop moving to about maybe 2 seconds. And then I'm going to go ahead and start to expand him a little bit. And you'll see that his legs are moving with that because I haven't pinned them, but I'm not really that concerned about it, right? So what we're going to do is we're just going to use these to make him have a little bit of a belly. And so now if I click off so I can see this, right, his belly button's like way lower than it should be. Right, but so now I've got something where, right, you've seen those like cheese ball ads about toning your stomach or something on that's on like every website ever, right? This is how they do some of that morphing, and you can see like I've got it set so it's going pretty slow. If I click and drag to select these points, I should be able to move all of these pin positions over. So you can see, right, if I have a position pin, position pins have have keyframes, and starch pins do not have keyframes, right? So I just want to make sure that I've got, okay, and that's a starch. I think it's just these few here. I'm going to select all of those, And I'm just going to pull this over so that this inflation happens much faster. So now let's go ahead and play this through. And we should get, okay, so now the previews are done. So now we can, right, we can make this little thing happen. You know, if I added a little bit to this, it could look like he's like floating on his back in water. But, right, so these are some of the ways that we can use this. Now, something else we can do with this is we can set it so that one object ends up behind another part of the same object. So let's go ahead and add some pins to his legs. So I'm going to go ahead and add a pin here. I did go back to frame 0. Add pins at his knees, and I'm not going to worry, add pins at his ankles, and add pins at his toes. So I'm not going to worry about getting the, about doing starch on any of these. And actually, I'm going to delete everything but his hips and his toes. Okay. So now there's some other things that happen with the Puppet Pin tool that we need to look at. And one of those is being able to place one part of the object in front of the other. Let's go down to his legs to start with. And again, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, just so basically his hips are in view. I'm actually going to expand the edges of this, the boundaries of this window. There we go. And I've got the puppet position pin selected. And I'm just going to select one of his feet, and I'm going to drag this over. And you'll notice that by default, whatever the last pin I placed is going to be on top, right? And so if you look at this, right, it's intersecting, but let's say for whatever reason, I actually want this other leg to be on top in this motion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use the what's called the Puppet Overlap Pin tool. I'm going to select that. I'm going to make sure I'm showing the mesh so I can see what's happening. And sorry, I'm also going to delete, oops, delete those real quick. Okay, so I want to make sure that I'm showing the mesh. I thought I had stepped back through all this, but I had not. And what I want to do is I want to say, this is the area, I definitely want this leg to be in front of the view. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and create a pin. Now when I do that and I have this tool selected, there's some settings up here that allow me to change things. Now this might be set differently for you, but it should, we want this to be set to 100. And right now the extent, I think mine was set to 54 or something by default, but right, I want to, if I extend the extent, right, then it's going to extend how much of the leg is in front. All right, so I want to do that. I want to drop another pin here and probably another pin everywhere down here so all of his toes and everything are covered up. And just in case we get a little bit more crossing happening, I'm going to go all the way up to, you know, here, more or less. And granted, this is not super exciting, but I want all of those to be 100%. Then what I want to do is, because this leg and this leg should be in front now, so if I uncheck Show Mesh and I just kind of click off in space somewhere, and don't have the puppet selected down here either, there we go. Right, now you'll see that this leg is now in front of this other leg. Right, and this is true for any body part, right? If you, like let's say that we were going to use our puppet pin position tool, we were going to select our puppet, and let's say we wanted to actually have this arm move in some horrible way and be in front of his stomach, right? So I'm going to go ahead and pull this deform pin down, right? And so you'll see that in this case, his arm is behind his stomach. So again, what I would need to do is just go to my puppet overlap tool. I can show the mesh so I can see things highlight, and I just want to click, even just there is enough to like have his hand pop out in front of his stomach. right? But I would probably want at least his whole forearm to be in front, right? This also happens, there's lots of other weird things that can happen, like if the mesh overlaps with itself. But yeah, these are the ways to basically control which side of the body that this object should be on. Now, the last type of pin that we need to talk about is the advanced pin. And so the advanced pin is new in the last couple versions of After Effects. And so let's go ahead and go to the advanced pin tool. Now, you'll see that I actually have a couple of these set. I'm going to go ahead and delete that pin. But what the advanced pin does is it gives you a bit more freedom to work. So I can come down here to his, actually let's do it on his head. I'm going to select the pin that's there. I'm going to delete it. And I'm going to go ahead and just create a advanced pin in the middle of his forehead, which should be entertaining. So what the advanced pin does is, first, it's like a position pin in that I can move the position around, right? So you can like bob his head back and forth if we want him to. The other thing it does is it allows me to expand, right, or contract the thing, right? So if I want to inflate his head, right, I can go ahead and use this to inflate his head. And the third thing that I can do with the advanced pin, and I'm going to go ahead and hit the letter H. I'm going to pull this up so I can actually see what I'm doing. I'm going to click on the pin, advanced pin again. If I hover in just the right spot, like right out here on this ring, I can actually rotate around that point as a center, right? So I can actually rotate his head. Now, for his head, this might not be exactly what I want to do, but maybe for his elbow, right, being able to rotate the elbow joint, and granted, it would be nice to have some starch pins around here, so maybe I can, throw a starch pin here and throw a starch pin here, and then go back to my my advanced pin and select this, right? And so now, right, I can actually rotate this elbow rather than just bending it and moving that position, right? So I can move the position, I can adjust rotation, I can actually use this to scale up the mesh, right? So you could have a fat or really skinny elbow. And it does kind of, I've noticed it, there we go. You have to go left and right with it, right? So it can either have a really tiny elbow, a really fat elbow, or somewhere in the middle. Right, and so this gives me a lot of options, right? I intentionally created one here in the center of the stomach, right? So I could actually swell his belly out some as well, right? So there's these, so these are the options we have to use with this tool. And again, keyframing, one way we can do it is to manually set it. The other way that we can keyframe is we can hold down the Command or Control key and click and drag on a point to animate that point in real time, right? And so I'm going to uncheck Show Mesh because that slows everything down. I'm going to hold down Control or Command, and I'm just going to click and drag and click and drag and click and drag and stop. Now you'll see that suddenly there's a whole bunch of keyframes that have started up there. So let's go ahead and pull this up a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and click Fit in terms of the size. And I'm going to go ahead and play this. And it's playing back in not real time right now. But once it gets done creating these preview frames, we can kind of see what happens here. Okay. So now that it's real time, let's see, right? Basically the rate at which I was having his head bob, his head is now bobbing. Right, and so this gives you this really nice ability to animate something in real time, right? So you can get that human feeling rather than just trying to keyframe things. You can actually move stuff around. So one other note, oftentimes when people animate using this form, they don't necessarily do it with one contiguous body, right? What they would do is they would have the arms as separate objects that they're pinning, and so they can rotate that whole layer for the shoulder, but they have pinned the arms or they've pinned the legs or whatever if you're doing this for like a figure or for like an animated figure. If you're doing it for grass or something else, you could do it this way. Or if you want something that's a little bit wet noodly, like Putin here, you can do the horrible things that I've done to this man's body, right? So if I want to control this, right, say I wanted to be able to control his arm, right, I can just, oh, that's his belly. I'm going to undo that real quick. I'm going to hold down Command, and I'm going to maybe make his little belly dance a little bit. Let that go. Right, and so now, right, as he's doing this, we'll wait till this previews. Right, and so his belly's dancing too. It's just getting to be really terrifying, but a lot of fun to do. Right, so this is another way that you can do animations, and right, that real-time recording allows you to give it much more of a human feel. So this is the Puppet Pin tool. There's other ways we can use it, but this really goes through most of the major notes, right? And so I would encourage you to use this and play with it and see what kind of crazy things you can make happen.